With the new Warframe update Isleweaver, Valkyr got a rework, and saying that this rework caused a little bit of a commotion in the Warframe community, well, that would be a bit of an understatement. We haven't had such a controversial topic in a long time, however, now it is finally here. I tested it, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. So, in today's video, we're gonna go over everything that changed, how to build Valkyr in 2025, and also, I'm gonna give you my personal verdict on it. As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now let's jump right into it. Now, also here, before we jump into the action, I quickly have to make one disclaimer. That being that it is now day 1 after the update, meaning everything I'm about to discuss in this video is based on the build of the game that is present right now. If there are bugs or changes that happen in the next couple days, I'm gonna do my best to keep you updated on it in the pinned comment. And secondly, I know that there are a lot of people with strong feelings about this Valkyr rework, and we're gonna discuss the rework in this video. You are very much encouraged to share your opinions in the comments down below. However, please keep it civil. Slurs and toxicity will not be accepted in this comment section. Okay? Okay. But now let's get into our skills and talk about what has changed here. First of all, the passive. Valkyr's new big thing is that she has this rage meter in the bottom right of the screen. This can fill up from 0 to 300%, and it has a line in the middle at 150%. Now, the percentage value next to it is a melee damage bonus that you get, and in order to increase that range meter, you need to hit enemies with melee attacks, take them out with melee attacks, or getting an assist. However, if you get a finisher on the enemy, that gives you much more percentage than just normal hits or kills. One important thing to note here is that the damage bonus is calculated in real time, meaning you can't snapshot it or anything, and if you don't build up the rage for a while, it will start to slowly go down again. Now, you might have been wondering, what about the line in the middle? Well, this is Valkyr's new invincibility mechanic. I'm just gonna call it rage gating. And what happens here is, if the meter is above that line and your health goes down to 0, then you don't die, but instead, the meter completely empties down to 0 again. You become invincible for 5 seconds, and there is no cooldown, meaning if you were to manage it to get the meter to up to 150% again before the 5 seconds of invincibility run out, then it is effectively possible to constantly stay invincible. Don't worry though, I know a lot of you have thoughts on this new mechanic and this new mechanic replacing her old invincibility. We're gonna get into that in more detail later in the video. Let's first though get into the rest of her kit with our first skill, Ripline. This one was changed quite a bit. First of all, the overall parkour movement that is connected to this skill has been made much smoother. You can now zip from wall to wall, cancel it by a jump mid-air, and effectively be Spider-Man. I gotta admit, I was actually surprised on how fun this thing actually was. However, it's not just movement shenanigans, this now has also some actual utility, and that is if you fire it at an enemy, then you will pull yourself towards that enemy, pull in all nearby enemies into one big blob, and strike them all in the process. This now is quite a nice grouping ability, doesn't have as much range as other grouping abilities, for example Mag's Pull has much more range, but still, if you mod for it, this here is very usable. Now, Ripline also has an augment called Swingline, but if I'm being honest, I think this is still not all that necessary. Ability number 2 is Warcry, and this one was basically changed the least. Just like before, it gives you melee attack speed and it increases your armor. The only change here is that it now has a little bit more of a base duration, and this buff now applies to all enemies in affinity range, which is very cool because affinity range is always 50 meters no matter how much range you build. It can also be recast, and when teammates lose the buff, it's enough if they just come back into the AoE and then they get the buff again without you having to recast it for them. All in all, I think that is a very good ability, very synergistic with Valkyr's kit, giving you a lot of armor, and the attack speed is very much appreciated. Now, there's also an augment here called Eternal War, which previously was actually pretty good because it makes it that you don't have to recast this ability, but now that you can simply press the button whenever you want and refresh the duration, I just think it's really not that big of a deal and it's not worth the mod slot anymore. Ability number 3 is Paralysis, and this now has been changed quite a bit. First of all, you don't lose shields and stuff anymore when you cast it, it's a normal ability, it costs energy, and that's it. Then, when you cast it, enemies in an area around you will get slowed and it will apply melee damage vulnerability to them so that melee attacks from you and allies against those affected enemies deal more damage. That is a very nice tool, just in case all the millions of red crits you're already dealing were not strong enough. Now, the real fun part about this skill though is the augment Prolonged Paralysis, which makes it that enemies that get hit by the Paralysis AoE will now also be pulled towards you. This is nothing new, it worked like that before. However, before there was an issue where some enemies just wouldn't get pulled in. That has now been solved, giving you the consistency that you expect from it, and a second grouping ability, allowing you to have the choice of either using your first skill to group up the enemies and not using the augment, or subsuming over your first skill and therefore getting your grouping with the augment for the 3. Don't worry, we talk about Helminth and subsumes a bit later. Up next though, let's talk about the big ultimate, her exalted weapon, Hysteria. Now, of course, the elephant in the room here is that it doesn't make you completely invincible anymore by default. Instead, as I said initially, we now have this passive rage gating mechanic that can keep us alive, and I'm gonna give you my thoughts on that later. What this skill also does is that the armor gained from Warcry, your second ability, is increased by 3 times while you're in your Hysteria state, so you get a big armor bonus. She's immune to status effects in that state, and the energy drain is much lower than before and also doesn't ramp up over time anymore, making it very easy and relatively cheap on the energy to keep this skill up constantly. And then finally, you also heal yourself for a really good chunk of health whenever you hit an enemy with her claws. However, her fourth ability is not only the Hysteria state, but it is also tied to her claw weapons. And remembering how back in the day the only viable thing on it was the slide attack, these talents now got a much needed overhaul in the form that, for example, attack animations were changed in the way that they now don't stop you in your motion anymore. It's much more fluid. They've gotten a bunch of force proc slashes into their combos, and now also a lot of the combos got increased multipliers, making it so that normal hits are finally now also viable and not just the spin to win playstyle. So yeah, overall, when we're talking about just the claws, I think we can all agree that this is a big W and much needed. However, Hysteria also comes with 2 augments, about which I want to talk very briefly because they're in my opinion both garbage. One of them is Enraged, which is actually really strong if you just look at the numbers, 350% more crit chance and more base damage. However, the problem with this is that it turns your Hysteria from a channeled ability into one with just a duration that can run out, which would be fine if it was not for the insanely long cooldown that it has, making this one just not viable to play in my opinion. And then the second one, Hysterical Assault, allows you to aim while being in the claw mode to leap at an enemy with an attack. I think this one could be fine for the sake of moving around, but then again, you have your first ability for that if you really want. And after one of those leaps, you gain 50% parkour velocity and 50% sprint speed, which is nice for mobility. However, I still very much think it is not worth the mod slot. And as always, leave a like for the video because otherwise I'm gonna send Clem after you. Now, so much for the abilities, how they look now, and what has changed. Before we take a look at the Valkyr build itself, I want to direct your attention to the Valkyr talents, taking a bit of a closer look at them. The base stats here look pretty darn nice. We have a high attack speed, a decent range for a claw type weapon, and this is the big one, 100% follow through. Meaning, unlike almost every other weapon in the game, if you hit multiple enemies with the same strike, they're all gonna take the full damage. That is incredibly strong. As for the damage stats themselves, 50 freaking% crit chance at a 2x multiplier, that is humongous, with unfortunately just a 10% status chance. Could be better, but I think it's still gonna be enough for what we're gonna go for. Now, let's also take a look at the builds where the first thing I want to talk about would be the Arcanes. And here my first thought was maybe going for melee afflictions, which would trigger when enemies are flung in the air or knocked down on the ground and give them many more status effects. However, in my testing, the grouping from her first as well as her third ability unfortunately did not trigger it, so I cannot recommend it. Up next, you could maybe go for Melee Vortex if you have a companion that reliably inflicts magnetic, because with your low status chance, your claws are probably not going to do that. But then again, you have one grouping ability and a second ability that can group with the augment, so you probably do not need an arcane on your weapon that also does the same thing, meaning really the only two feasible options that I see here would be Melee Exposure for much more corrosive damage if that is what you want to go for, or of course, the best option being Melee Influence. What a surprise! Now, for the talents build itself, I actually just want to show one single build in this video today because I just think Melee Influence is that much superior, so that's what I went for. And here we have the standard stuff. Base damage with Prime Pressure Point, although you could go for Condition Overload if you have a companion that does good priming. With your own weapon alone, this is not gonna work, so I went for Prime Pressure Point. And then for a lot of crit chance and crit damage with Blood Rush as well as Galvanized Steel being actually a better crit damage mod than Organ Shatter. Weeping Wounds to increase our status chance a little bit. I know it is not much, but I feel Weeping Wounds is a good mod to trigger Melee Influence consistently because it needs the occasional electricity proc. That's why, of course, Shocking Touch to mod electricity onto the weapon is important. One thing to mention here is, Volt's ability Shock with the Shock Trooper Augment is not a subzoom that I would recommend because it does not work for the talents. It doesn't put electricity on them, don't use it, you gotta mod for it. And then lastly, of course, a faction damage mod as well as an elementalist mod so that the electricity procs that we inflict deal more damage over time. Although, with the low status chance that we have right here, it might be worth it to drop the Elementalist mod altogether and just use something else that gives us more damage, for example Organ Shatter for more crit damage, because we're not going to inflict that many electricity effects that the damage over time is that high, so I think more flat damage would be viable too. And then finally I went for Primed Reach because I think having 5 meter radius is much more convenient than just having 2. As you see, I do not go for any attack speed mod because honestly, I think you don't need it. You don't even need an arcane on your Valkyr to increase the attack speed because Warcry gives you more than enough. But so much for her claws. Let's now finally talk about how to build Valkyr herself, and here the first thing I want to get into is a little bit of a more budget-friendly approach, which includes a healthy mix of strength, range, and duration, because with the rework she's not solely focused on strength anymore, but actually likes to have a decent mix. So much for that. Let's now take a look at the Steel Path build that I'm playing, and this one is actually really darn easy to play. When you go into the mission, of course, you activate your 4th ability to hack away at the enemies. Also, keep your 2 up all the time for the attack speed and armor bonus. And then you either use your 1st ability to group up enemies, or the 3rd ability with the augment. Choice here is yours. If you feel like the enemies are a bit tougher, then sure, use your 3rd ability to give them damage vulnerability, and that would already be it. Now, as always, let's first talk about helmet options, where the initial question would be, which ability would you even subzoom over? I mean, it's pretty obvious you're not going to subzoom over her 4, and you're also ideally not subzooming over her 2, because these ones are, in my opinion, a must-have. And then for the other 2, it comes down to one thing. See, both of them can group up enemies. The problem here is, though, that if you want to do it with your 3rd ability, you need 1 more mod slot to use the augment, otherwise it won't group. So if your build is very tight on mod space and you can't afford that augment, then it's probably better to keep her first for the grouping and subzoom over her 3, even though you lose out on the damage vulnerability portion. However, if you can fit the augment in, then definitely subzoom over her first and keep both the grouping and the damage vulnerability infliction from the 3. As to which abilities to put on her, I kind of feel like a broken record at this point because I talked about a lot of Exalted melee frames lately, but yeah, Roar is always very strong, Nourish is always very nourishing, Wrathful Advance from Kullervo gives you the fattest red crit numbers in the world, and finally, and I think this one is particularly interesting for the new Valkyr when you want to take her in Elite Archimedia, Mirage's Eclipse for the damage reduction, because even though Valkyr gets bazillion tons of armor, she lacks a personal damage reduction ability, making her much squishier than other Warframes, so Eclipse will make that much smoother. But which helmet are you using? Let us know in the comments down below. Next, let's talk Archon shards, and this one is, again, as simple as it gets. For the sake of testing, I used 2 yellow ones into more casting speed, but I wouldn't recommend doing that. I feel like it doesn't do all too much for her. Instead, just do it like I did in my videos on the other melee Exalted frames. Go all purple one into more melee crit damage, because that makes number go big. And with all that out of the way, I have two different builds prepared for you on Valkyr. One is focused on using the rage-gating mechanic to stay alive, and the other one is your standard health tanking approach. Let's start with the health tanking first. This right here would be it, where the first thing I need to mention is, please ignore Marked for Death right here. This was an old setup, I just did not have any other page to put the build in. Ideally, you would want to use any of the aforementioned helmet abilities instead. And first and foremost here, I want to talk about the survivability part, where, of course, you could go with a triple Umbral setup, going for health, armor, and intensify. If you already have Umbral mods on your Valkyr, then probably that's the way to go for here, but I personally think it's actually overkill, and I didn't go into that at all. Instead, I used Arcane Blessing to increase my maximum health by up to 1200. I went for Archon Intensify, which gives you up to 60% ability strength, easy to keep up because you take constant damage of course, and with your fourth ability you're healing yourself, so that works. And then for the armor, I don't think you need to mod or upgrade at all because you have such a high base armor that gives you already 76.9% damage reduction by default, and then your second ability increases that even further, and with your fourth ability, the armor bonus from your second ability is tripled. So yeah, you're gonna have like 2,000 to 3,000 armor without even modding for it, which will give you so much damage reduction that you're basically already hitting the soft cap for armor. However, one thing that you definitely should use on a health tanking build would be Adaptation as a second layer of damage reduction. And as I previously said, if you wanted to go into Temporal Archimedia, enemy level 500 and health tank, then probably your Subsume should be Mirage's Eclipse, because that would be another layer of 75% damage reduction. So much for the survivability. The rest of the build is a healthy mix of strength, range, and duration. Strength, obviously, to increase your buffs and also the damage from your 4. Duration, of course, to keep your buffs up longer, more convenient. And then do not underestimate range, because with the Prolonged Paralysis augment, you give your third ability grouping, and that needs a bit of range, which is why I went for Overextended to give a fat 90%. Sure, it costs us some ability strength. If you wanted to, you could maybe go for a stretch instead, but I think the range is worth it. My ability strength comes from Blind Rage, Archon Intensify, and Mold Augmented, the duration from Prime Continuity, and the energy economy from Prime Flow, as well as Equilibrium. In the Exalted, you can go with whatever you like. I went for Preparation because it's very convenient, and because your fourth ability gives you status immunity, that includes knockdown, so you do not need Prime Surefooted right here in case you want to be safe from knockdown. And lastly, in the Aura, I went for Growing Power that gives even more ability strength, but also here, you do you, Valkyr does not need anything specific here. Now, so much for the health tanking build. However, if you want to go even higher in the enemy levels, then health tanking is just not an option anymore. You will need the rage gating mechanic to stay alive, and that is exactly what this build right here is made for. Now, the first thing I want to mention here is that my Subsume here is not in the first slot, it is actually in the third, because as I previously mentioned, my build space here was very tight, so I wasn't really able to squeeze the augment in. That's why I went for the first skill as my grouping tool and subsumed over the 3. The main difference here is of course that I'm not modding for any defenses whatsoever because I'm purely relying on my rage gating mechanic. That's why I have a lot more range with Overextended plus Stretch, that is very nice, and also more duration with Prime Continuity and Constitution, more strength with Blind Rage, Archon Intensify, Mold Augmented like before, but this time also Energy Conversion. If you wanted to though, you could replace it with Transient Fortitude, basically does the same thing, just that this one here costs you ability duration and this one doesn't. And then the energy economy again is fulfilled by Equilibrium, but this time I'm not using a primed flow mod. I'm using Arcane Battery, which increases your maximum energy based on how much armor you have, and yeah, well, I think we're not gonna struggle with energy with this one. But alright, we've looked at her entire kit now, we've discussed the builds, let's finish up the video by my personal verdict on the Valkyr rework. Is she in a better spot right now? This is going to be my opinion, you're free to disagree, and I'm looking forward to the discussion in the comments down below. Now, first of all, I think we can all agree that in most ways, she's gotten, of course, much of an improvement. Her 1 is now useful beyond just being a movement ability due to the fact that it can group enemies. Her 3 is in a better spot too, and of course the changes to the combos and the damage scaling for her Exalted claws was much needed. Now you can actually use them beyond the spin to win. But yeah, I think we can all agree on that. The thing where people actually were negative about it was the fact that she lost the complete invincibility that she used to have before while being in her 4th ability. And now that I tested it myself, I think the rage gating mechanic actually compensates for the loss in invincibility quite decently, because if you have high enemy density, then this rage meter goes up in absolutely no time and you shouldn't have any problem to get it over the threshold in your 5 seconds of invincibility. Now, you might say this is terribly inconsistent. If you are in a scenario where there's low enemy density, then this whole house of cards collapses, and that is unfortunately true. But then on the other hand, previously it kinda was the same thing too, right? Her 4th ability ate up so much energy over time that on low enemy density maps, if you weren't getting kills like crazy, your invincibility would also run out just for the simple fact that you couldn't refuel in time. That is why I think overall the rage gating mechanic is fine. It works well enough in the same scenarios where the previous invincibility worked well enough, and it doesn't work in the scenarios where the previous invincibility also didn't work. The only real disadvantage that I see with this is you're pretty much forced to use melee influence to hit and kill even more enemies even faster, because that's just what you need to fuel the rage meter. I don't like that because melee influence is already much too overused, and this way it just incentivizes the use on her even more. As a conclusion, I would say Valkyr got many improvements across the board. However, subjectively, I'm personally not all too excited about her as a whole, and the reason for that is that we have a lot of Exalted melees in the game, and all of these melee Exalted weapons are special in some way that makes them different enough that you actually want to play the frame for the Exalted weapon. However, on Valkyr, her Exalted weapon are Exalted claws, which of course are very strong, but in reality, the mechanics are exactly the same as any other standard claw type weapon. If you wanted to run around and kill everything with claws while being completely invincible, you can just put the Valkyr Prime on Revenant, subsume maybe Wrathful Advance, and you're gonna have a pretty similar experience. Sure, not saying it's the rework that made it that way, she was having the same issue beforehand already, just saying that out of all the Exalted melee frames in the game, Valkyr is probably my least favorite one. And one thing that you definitely also should check out would be the new Warframe Oraxia and her signature weapons, which are actually really darn good, and that's why you should check out WarframeFlo's video on her weapons right now. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Cell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Lycon Shepherd, Undercanio2, Pepperwolf, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Circuitous the Almighty Rat, Leo Murasaki, Damon, Shadow Lockhart, Trollaloxen, Kiski, Herantares, Patricider, Christopher S. Mawson, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.